my name is Jarvis Lepper, and welcome to the podcast, Voices on the Journey. Today we're looking at common myths people believe about the first Christmas. And to address the topic today is Dr. Craig Evans, who is a professor at Houston Baptist University in Texas. Welcome, Dr. Evans.
Hey, thank you, Jarvis. Good to be with you.
You made it across the border without crossing the border.
Yeah, I was searched and rubber gloved, but yeah, I got across the border and they said, okay, the guy's been in Canada a long time, so, it was suspicious, but they let me in.
And you were my professor at Acadia University, and Acadia Divinity College is part of that, and I hope that I didn't give you a hard time.
I got over it. Everything's fine. So, life moves on. Yeah, we're good. We're good, Jarvis.
You're good. All right.
Yeah.
That's good news. And I heard a rumor that you're the author and editor of more than 70 books.
That's true. Actually, it's more than 90, but then who's counting?
What are your finger exercises for all that?
Yeah, I know. I'm getting frequent motion syndrome. It's tough. I got to stop counting my books. It's not good for me.
You'll have to hire a typer. So you've been on Dateline, the Discovery Channel, History Channel, and so many others. And you've served as a consultant for the National Geographic Society and also the Bible miniseries with Mark Burnett and his wife.
Yeah, that's right. The Bible miniseries aired a few years back on History Channel, and we set a record. It was the most watched program History Channel ever showed. There were 100 million people who tuned in and watched either all of it or part of it. And Mark Burnett and Roma Downey. Roma, remember, was the angel Monica in the show Touched by an Angel 25 years ago. She's a real sweetheart. It was wonderful working with him. And Stone Phillips, back in the day when he hosted Dateline NBC, a very nice person, a gentleman, a seeker, truly interested in knowing more about what the Bible says, more about God, more about faith. And so I've had some great experiences. The National Geographic thing, my goodness, the Gospel of Judas project, and a variety of other things watched by millions of people. And so it was just the other day I was thinking, how can I top that? I've been to the Vatican. I actually sang in a rehearsal with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. I have preached in the largest church in the United States. I've been on all these television programs. How can I top that? And then Jarvis reached out and said, you can be on my blog. And I thought, or on my podcast, I thought, you know what? I've arrived. So I'm so glad to be with you, Jarvis. This is wonderful.
Now you can retire.
Yeah, I know. I know. My bucket list, everything's checked off. I've done the whole thing. So this is really good. Thank you.
Well, seriously, thank you for being part of this. And if you're looking for a Christmas gift idea, Dr. Evans, you have a new book called Jesus and the Manuscripts, What We Can Learn from the Oldest Text. And according to Amazon, this book weighs 2.35 pounds. So this book is not only good for mental gymnastics, but if you're looking to lose a few pounds like me, perhaps this is a good investment.
Yeah, you should buy 20, 30 copies, Jarvis. And for your family and friends, it's a great gift, Christmas gift, you're right. But before you mail them out to your friends, carry the box up and down the stairs several times, and it won't be long before you're as fit as a fiddle. You'll be a six-pack once again, like you were in seminary.
Yes,
not that many years ago. So there you go. Okay. Yeah, Jesus and the Manuscripts. That's the book, and I know our topic is on the Christmas narratives in Matthew and Luke, and that's a very important topic. Of course, it's a very important topic for this time of year. But my book addressed the whole question of, how good are these manuscripts? And Matthew and Luke are two of the four Gospels, and they're the two that have the Christmas story in them. And, there's been this stuff out and about saying you can't trust them. The manuscripts are garbled. There are all kinds of errors and mistakes, and so we don't really know what the text originally said. Well, if that's true, then the Christmas story goes right out the window before we get started. And so my book does speak to this question, I think, in a relevant way. And I can give you a couple of highlights. One of them is we have a lot of manuscripts. They're very old. They get very close to when the originals were written, and the text is stable. And that's important because a lot of texts from antiquity aren't. We have 2 or 3 copies, and we compare them, and we see massive differences. That's not the case with the New Testament manuscripts. And the reason, I think, is because not only did the earliest followers of Jesus respect these stories, they didn't want to invent new ones or change them. They wanted to just tell the original story over and over again. But the autographs, and that's a way of referring to the originals, the ones that the authors actually produced, the autographs remained in circulation for a long time. We actually have evidence of that they remained in circulation over 100 years, in some cases perhaps 200 years. And that means it's the original, not a copy of a copy, but the original that gets copied again and again and again, and that stabilizes the text. And that's why in the hundreds of old texts, the thousands of pre-printing press texts that we have, it's the same text. Sure, you do have some discrepancies, and scribes do make mistakes, but they also correct them. And that's why I think we can turn to Matthew and Luke and say these are the Christmas accounts that Matthew and Luke provided us, and these are not some wild, crazy stories that got added later that nobody knows about. But it's all part of a very stable and authentic tradition.
So you said there were 20,000 lines that show consistency with a few minor differences?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the way books were copied in antiquity, if you count the letters and how many lines are on a page, it's not like a modern book that has more words, more lines on a page. The older books, the print was a little bit larger and so on. And so, yeah, 20,000 words would represent, or 20,000 lines would represent the whole of the Greek New Testament, all 27 books that are in the New Testament. So that would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, all of the letters that were written, and then, of course, the book of Revelation at the end. So there'd be 20,000 lines, and there are only 40 lines out of 20,000. So just do the math. So that's not even 1%. You've got 40 lines out of 20,000 where we're not quite sure how it should read. And so is it this word or is it that word? We're not quite sure in just 40 of these lines. And all 40 of those lines where there's a little bit of uncertainty, they don't touch on any important teaching. So it's not like the Trinity goes out the window or the Lord's Prayer. We have no idea what Jesus said, or the Beatitude. No, nothing like that. There's no uncertainty about anything that is important, anything that has been historically Christian teaching.
Well, thank you for doing your homework to give us such a great answer on that. Is there any recent news with regard to manuscripts that we should be aware of?
Well, we keep finding there's news all the time. Not a year goes by that there's not some news. And mostly it's positive in the sense that we have found another old manuscript. It might be a small fragment. The oldest fragment of the Gospel of Mark, for example, was published a couple years ago. It's just pieces of a few verses from chapter 1, but that's significant. The fragment dates probably to the 2nd century. And that's exciting. Another old fragment of the Gospel of Luke was found as well. And that's been published. And there are more fragments yet to be published. And then, of course, negatively, there's always some sensational thing. Somebody comes along and says, we found a new gospel that proves something. And usually these are fragments of gospels written in the 2nd or 3rd centuries. They're heretical. They want to change the Jesus story, tell us about Jesus and Mary Magdalene, for example. And then people write books about it like Da Vinci Code and go bananas. Well, one came out a few years back, and it was called The Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And that was a scandal and a sensation. And it turned out it was bogus. Turns out this document was prepared probably 10 or 12 years ago and on ancient papyrus, but the ink was applied a couple years after my grandson was born.
So the ink must have been darker.
The ink was a little too black, a little too glossy, a little too new. When this story broke a number of years ago, a reporter called me up, wanted my opinion. And I said, I think this is a modern text. It's a phony text. It's not as old as my grandson. And unfortunately, that made headlines. And I thought, uh-oh, maybe I overstated this. But it turned out I probably didn't. My grandson is 16, and the text is probably only 10 or 12 years old. So there you have it. So yeah, Jarvis, things happen all the time. Good stuff is found. It's mostly good stuff. It gets published, people talk about it, and we get closer and closer and closer back in time to the original stories when they were written down. And we continue to see stability. It's the same text, it's the same story. We're not discovering, oh my goodness, here's a whole new Jesus we didn't know about. It's the same Jesus, there he is, and the gospel stories got it right. And the scribes who copied them and made more copies, they got it right. And so when you sit down with your Bible in English translation, that's okay. You're reading an English translation of the Greek text, and the Greek text is the original Greek text. You're not reading a fairy tale that somebody made up in the Middle Ages.
And often at Christmas and Easter every year, there seems to be a new story about Jesus. That's what sells.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, it's a marketing strategy. I'm a little bit cynical about that, and I think everybody should be. Somebody's got a brand new theory, and it's a real corker. And usually, given the left wing skeptical bias of the news media and popular media, if it's an embarrassment to the church, if it's iconoclastic, if it somehow undermines the traditional Christian view, then they sensationalize it and talk about it. And the Da Vinci Code has to be the all-time blockbuster for doing that, and it's filled with errors. And so I wouldn't be surprised if somebody makes an outlandish claim. I hope my own book, Jesus and the Manuscripts, I hope it puts the brakes on that kind of nonsense. Because, by the way, there's a lot of fresh and new stuff that people can learn. You don't have to wait for the latest sensation and big headline to discover that there's something new. There's a lot of very new stuff that people don't know about. And that's what I'm talking about. And my book has pictures of these manuscripts. They're beautiful color plates at the back of the book. A lot of people don't realize it, but Jesus is talked about, including the Christmas story in the Quran. And Muhammad, who was the principal contributor to the Quran, he didn't doubt for a moment the Christmas story. It's really interesting. He accepted that and defended Mary's honor, defended the virgin birth, and defended the idea that, Jesus's conception was of God, and that Jesus was, the real McCoy, the genuine article. It's interesting. A lot of people don't know that. The Quran has problems and has things that are wrong, but Jesus is there. Jesus is in the Jewish literature, the Talmud, for example. The rabbis talk about him. And Jesus shows up in a variety of contexts. There were ancient magicians who invoked Jesus's name for healing and protection against evil spirits. So there's a lot of fascinating stuff about Jesus in manuscripts, not just the Christian manuscripts that happen to be in the New Testament. So there's a lot of new stuff there.
And manuscripts continue to be discovered. So in a couple of years' time, your book will not weigh 3 pounds, but 6 pounds.
Well, you know what? If the good Lord gives me a sound mind and strength, I could see 10 years from now updating it. I'll have to, because as you just said, every year that goes by, there'll be more discoveries. And so there'll be more chapters that need to be added to the book, more pictures and so on. And so maybe I'll get that book up to 4 or 5 pounds. And that'll be good for you and others who need to get into shape. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind, Jarvis.
Accountability is good.
Yeah.
Just one more question in this area. Where are most of these manuscripts found? Monasteries?
Well, when we originally found them, yeah, many of the manuscripts, like medieval manuscripts, whole books, leather-bound books with pages and pages in them. They were found in monasteries, but these fragments that we've been talking about, books that are only a few pages or just a single page, part of a page, they were found in the dry sands of Egypt, some of them in tombs, some of them in mummies, and the vast majority at Oxyrhynchus. It's a city in Egypt, a few miles to the west of the Nile River and about 100 or so miles south, a little more than that, south of Cairo. Anyway, in a place called Oxyrhynchus, and you get a prize if you can spell that correctly, at a place at Oxyrhynchus in the dry sands of what had been the trash heaps, the rubbish heaps of the city down through the centuries. Papyrus was found dating back all the way to, even before Christ, and 500,000, if you can imagine, 500,000 pages of ancient text recovered, and only about 10% of it has been published to date. So that's why I say that every year there's going to be a surprise, because there are box loads. And by the way, I've seen some of those box loads. I was in Oxford a couple of times a while back, and these big containers were brought out. They look like Tupperware boxes. They are filled with papyri. And I've handled them. I actually held them in my hands. So I know what the ancient papyrus feels like. I know what they look like, the dry, oxidized ink on the page. That's why when the phony the Gospel of Jesus' Wife came out, I looked at a high-resolution digital image of that and said, man, that's not old. I've held real old papyri in my hands, and that's not one of them. And so anyway, yeah. So the ongoing publishing, hundreds of these papyri are published every single year. And usually a few of them are Christian, and usually one or two of them are New Testament. And so, yeah, we're going to go on. As long as we're alive and doing this work, there will be some more interesting discoveries.
You'll have to move your office over to the Middle East.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I've thought about that, or Oxford anyway, and just bury myself in the papyri. They are looking for volunteers. So if you want to spend years acquiring a skill that will pay minimum wage, you can do that. You too can become learned and very poor if you want.
All right, I'll keep that in mind. Well, let's get to the Christmas questions.
Okay.
Professor James Smart said there are two Christs in the world, and that is the historical biblical Christ, who is always competing with the Christ of our imaginations. And often our imaginations add to the Christmas story. And the addition might seem really nice, but the Bible does not always talk about these traditions that we add on. So Dr. Evans is going to look at some common myths people believe about the first Christmas. So are you ready for the first question?
All right, I'm ready.
All right. I'll give you a simple one. Is it true that Mary rode into Bethlehem on a donkey? Was she on that 100-plus kilometer journey? Is that story true?
Well, we simply don't know. That's the problem. And it's an assumption. It's a reasonable assumption. Would Mary walk that distance in a state of expectancy? I don't know. But she might have been in a cart. But it's possible that she sat on a donkey for part of the journey and did a lot of walking also. Part of the problem there, Jarvis, is that we just don't appreciate how people, journeyed in those days. I'm not going to mention his name, but you probably know which professor I'm talking about. He retired just as I joined Acadia's faculty. But he lived one block from the school, and he often drove. And that's so modern of us. This whole question came up. Sepphoris was a Greco-Roman style Jewish city, but Sepphoris is about 4 miles from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. And so the question was, well, Sepphoris was undergoing a lot of building and expansion at the beginning of the first century, in the teens, when Jesus would have been a young man before he became involved in his public ministry. Well, Joseph was a carpenter. And so there's Jesus, he's a carpenter, son of a carpenter. So one of the theories is that he did a lot of carpentry and building work at a city that's doing a lot of that kind of work. Sepphoris was 4 miles away. And a prominent scholar said, well, it would take a whole day to get there, so it's not likely he ever went to Sepphoris. Isn't that strange? I mean, my goodness. And of course, a whole day, it's 4 miles. And you could, if you walked fast, you could do the trip in about 45 minutes. If you walked slowly and leisurely, an hour and a half, or 10 minutes by tour bus. And so the idea that, who would walk 4 miles? Well, that's our modern way of thinking. And people in the third world, even today, still walk a long time. We're so lazy, we Westerners, we get in a car. And so for us, we can't imagine, 100 clicks over the course of maybe 3 days, 4 days, something like that. Like, oh my gosh, poor Mary, she'd have to be, mounted on an animal or in a cart or something like that. Chances are she did a lot of walking.
She was tough.
Yeah, sure. She walked. I mean, I imagine she was fit, lean and mean. And what's the problem? But it isn't necessarily wrong showing her, on a donkey. It's just we don't know. And so it's just part of our imagination. And that's fine.
And saying I don't know is healthy, part of scholarship.
Well, I think, that's more factual, right? If we don't know, if there's no evidence, then it's factual to say, well, we don't know. There isn't any evidence. Instead of being fictional and saying, well, this is the way it must have been. So it's okay to say, of course, people did ride on horses. People rode on donkeys.
Camels.
People also did a lot. Yeah, camels. People did a lot of walking. And of course, there were little wagons and carts that were used too. So it's just we don't know.
Yeah. We often think people in the first century were uneducated. We think that we know more than they did. Was Mary illiterate and didn't know anything?
Well, of course, that's a real tough question. We're not told one thing about Mary's literacy. We have that beautiful Magnificat, as it's called, because that's the first word when she sings in the Latin translation. Magnificat magnifies my soul, the Lord, and on it goes. And the reason I mention it is just replete with allusions to Scripture. Now, did she learn all these allusions to Scripture because she was reading it all the time, or did she learn it because she was hearing it all the time in the synagogue? Well, the answer is we don't know. But we can address the larger question, which is about literacy. And there was an assumption that was around 30, 40 years ago that just about everybody was illiterate. And this was advanced. In fact, it was even suggested that maybe only 5% or at most 10% of men could read. Almost no women, very, very few women. And so the overall literacy rates would have been something like 4 or 5% for the whole population. And I challenged that in some publishing not long ago, and I think I've had some success in influencing the thinking of scholars on it. And the reason is, the observation is simply this: everywhere we know people lived in antiquity in abundance, a lot of people, something like a city or an outpost or something where there were a lot of people. And in those places where the climate, the weather, the elements permit survival of written material, we find written material, and a lot of it. And so let's go back to Oxyrhynchus, that Egyptian city in the sand that nobody can spell its name. This was not, it wasn't Oxford or Cambridge. It wasn't, in other words, Alexandria. It wasn't Ephesus. It wasn't Rhodes. It wasn't some illustrious city. It was a commercial city. It's, as I liken it, for those who know California, it's Bakersfield. They grow crops, and they put the crops on the boats that then go down the Nile River to Alexandria and ship their lettuces and watermelons all over the place. Oxyrhynchus is simply Bakersfield. And we find 500,000 pages of papyrus in the trash. And books were valuable. And so things aren't thrown out unless they're just falling apart. And of course, a lot of this stuff are paper, documents, letters, and so on. It seems like a lot of people could read and write in Oxyrhynchus, which isn't Oxford. It isn't Cambridge. It's Bakersfield. So that tells us, man, a lot of people could read and write. And then we find evidence like this. Graffiti. People writing on the walls all over the place, and they don't always know how to spell. Their grammar is bad, and the subject matter is vulgar. And yet, these poorly educated people can read and write. Do you realize, Jarvis, blogging was invented in the first century? We all thought, no, blogging was invented, in the computer age. They invented blogging in early Rome. People would write a comment on the wall, and somebody else would write a reply, and somebody would write a reply to it, and then somebody would write a rejoinder. And we have found blogs written on walls with more than 200 comments.
Wow.
Well, who are these people doing all this writing? So what this tells me is there was literacy. It's a lot higher than 5%. And so to say, well, Mary couldn't have read. She couldn't read. Neither could Joseph. Neither could Jesus. His disciples couldn't read either. So whoever wrote the Gospels couldn't be the apostles because the apostles couldn't read. There is no call for that kind of skepticism. People were able to read and write. Not everybody. I'm sure there were illiterate people, even as there are today. But lots of people could read. And if you do look at the literature from the time, the Roman governors say, I want this letter posted in the public square so everybody can read it and no one has an excuse for not knowing the law. Well, that presupposes much higher rates of literacy. So could Jesus read and write? I don't think there's any doubt that he could read. Now, by the way, you say read and write. Writing requires some skill. How to make a pen, how to acquire and make ink, how to get paper, how to prepare the paper for writing. It's, you and me, we can just start keyboarding. We're writing. We can pick up a pen. You and I don't have to make the ink. We can pick up a notepad. We didn't have to make or find out how to acquire paper. It's all over the place. But in Jesus's day, I think lots of people could read, and then professional scribes did the writing. And that's how Scripture got written, too. So I think the idea that the Holy Family was illiterate or Jesus and his disciples couldn't read, I think there's no call for that at all.
Is there a connection between Hannah and Mary? Since we're on the topic of Mary, would you like to expand on that?
Well, interestingly enough, Luke picks up on this, Dr. Luke, and the way he tells the Christmas story. In his gospel. So it's probably what happened was he realized there's this character, this elderly woman named Anna. And Anna in Greek and also in Latin, that's the Hebrew name Hannah. And so here's Jesus presented in the temple. Here's somebody singing. And Dr. Luke realized, hey, this is a lot like Hannah singing in the temple, thanksgiving to God for giving her a son. And that, of course, is Samuel. So it's a beautiful story. And so this is something you see in Scripture sometimes. It's called typology. So if you have this really significant story in the Old Testament, and then something in the New Testament happens that's similar, what you do then is you tell the New Testament story in a way that you underscore the parallels, and so it sounds a whole lot like the older story. And so you have a Magnificat of about 10 verses long on the lips of Mary in Luke chapter 1, and you have a Magnificat on the lips of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, after she has dedicated the little boy that she had prayed for earnestly, because she didn't have any children prior to that. And so she names him Shemuel, which means the Lord hears, the Lord listens. The Lord heard her prayer and gave her conception, and she gave birth to this little boy. And so she dedicates him to the temple. And then she sings for 10 verses, exalting and praising God because he has heard her prayer. And so that's the thing about Luke's, and Matthew too. The way they both tell their Christmas stories, they're inviting the reader to think about these connections with the Old Testament. And so what they're doing is they're showing that God's mighty saving deeds in the Old Testament are being replicated in the New, because Samuel was a hugely important person. What did Samuel do, among other things? He anointed David as Israel's new king. And of course, it's from the line of David that Jesus emerges. And so you can see why the biblical writer wants to draw that connection. It's like, hey, there's no coincidence here. And so this woman prayed for conception. God gave her conception. And that brings Samuel into the world, dedicated the temple. And then, of course, he anoints David, and it's from the line of David. God gives someone else conception, Mary. She brings the child to dedicate at the temple. She too sings the song of praise to God for about 10 verses, and we call that the Magnificat. I could go on, and these are the kinds of typologies that take place. And I hope when people hear the Christmas stories of Matthew and Luke, they appreciate that, because that really adds a lot of meaning to these stories.
I've been to the Church of the Nativity, and no doubt you've been there numerous times. And most people don't know, in the basement there's a cave. Do you think that when we think of the Nativity that it should be a big drafty barn, or do you think that it's actually a cave?
Well, when it comes to these two very special churches, one of them is the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and the other one is the one you just mentioned, the Church of the Nativity. I think the Holy Sepulchre has a real good claim to being the right location. There's history, there's historical village memory, there's archaeological confirmation. Boy, but the Church of the Nativity, who knows? Who knows? And there were caves, of course, out and about, and the shepherds would keep their sheep in some of these caves. I've been in them. I've been to Bethlehem many times. I've wandered around in the fields, and I've been in caves. And I've been in the Church of the Nativity several times, and I've crawled down into that little grotto. But I'm very skeptical about the Church of the Nativity, and I hope that doesn't disappoint your audience. But the problem is there's just no continuity. There's no connection between that spot and traceable historical memory, the way we have for the other church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So anyway, the way houses were built, and there's been study on that, it might be on the side of a hill, and underneath is like a garage, is where you keep some animals. You just might only have a cow and a donkey and 2 sheep, and that's all you have. And you want to protect them from loss or theft or whatever, and so they're closed in. And then there's upstairs, there's more of a house. So it's possible that Joseph and Mary were in not a cave exactly, but they're in the manger area where the animals would be, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We kind of tell it like, oh my gosh, they went to Holiday Inn, there was no room in the inn, so they had to sleep out, in a storage shed or something like that. I don't think it's quite like that. They're in the house, they're in a place, and they have some privacy. And they have their own, quarters, as it were. Humble, to be sure. It's not a palace. But a cave, I don't know. I don't know about this cave story, this cave tradition.
And you said there are many caves on the hills of Bethlehem. I've been in those caves too. Is there any evidence that these caves were attached to homes?
Well, I don't know. I don't know the archaeological evidence there. I don't think so. Typically when we do archaeology, it's an area that had been a city or at least a village of something. So there'd be several houses. I'm not aware, other than a fortress or something like that out in the middle of the wilderness, I'm not aware of just a freestanding house out in the field somewhere that has been excavated. So I'm not sure about that. I rather think, instead of being outside the town in a shepherd's hut, The Holy Family were in Bethlehem. They were just in a situation where they were not in a crowded lodging house, but were in fact, with some privacy where the animals were kept stabled. But it wasn't a big drafty barn. That picture, no, that's not right either.
I've been to Egypt and in some people's homes there, and they live with their animals.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the same idea. That's what I'm talking about. So it wasn't real strange. I did a week of archaeological excavation on the island of Cyprus. And there was an earthquake in the 4th century where a house collapsed. And unfortunately, as far as we know, everyone in the house died. And when it collapsed, the basement where the animal was kept, it collapsed too. And there was the skeletal remains of a donkey, and it had its halter on. There was a chain, and at the end of the chain was a woman's hand. The skeleton of somebody 18, 19 years old was trying to pull the donkey out of this garage, if you want to call it that, stable that was part of the house, and she died in the earthquake. And so we have rather graphic archaeological evidence for this house design that you're talking about.
So there was no innkeeper, no inn in that first Christmas story. It's not the Best Western, as you said.
No,
but a guest room. Is that how to best translate that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. There's been a lot of discussion about how to interpret the word that occurs in the Greek text and the underlying word that would have been in Aramaic or Hebrew. And guest room is probably the best idea. So it'd be like, here's my house. I'm at home, and right here to my right is a guest room. And if somebody's already in it, a friend of ours, a man and a wife, and they're in there, and then somebody comes to the door, and I say, I'm sorry, there's no room in our guest room. It's occupied. However, there's room in our garage. We don't have a donkey in our garage. We have a Honda Accord, but that's what's in our garage, and you can stay there if you want. And so it's kind of like that.
So the Lord's Supper, was that in a guest room?
Yeah, probably so. Yeah, and of course that would have been a premium because that's Passover time,
right?
And so you have people coming to Jerusalem in the days leading up to the Passover celebration, and so Jesus has connections. We have every reason to believe he had disciples. The Gospel of John reflects that Jesus has acquaintances and disciples in and around Jerusalem, including Bethany. And so, if you can't get into the city for Passover celebration, you want to be next door to the city. But Jesus is able to get into the city, and he actually has a little bit of security there. You get the impression there's some private arrangement and security because he knows full well that the ruling priests are out to get him. And so he wants to spend this final Last Supper with his disciples undisturbed. And it would be in one of these guest rooms.
You and I have been in those caves on the Bethlehem Hills, and in some of those caves you see these stone mangers. Do you think that these stone mangers reflect the first century mangers, or should we picture a wooden manger that we often see in the nativity scenes today?
Well, we don't know. There could well have been wooden structures used as mangers. We do find feeding troughs and water troughs from antiquity. And so we're not told in the Gospels that Jesus is laid in a wooden manger or a stone manger. We're just not told. And so it would be something like that. I mean, these things are left over from and survived from antiquity.
And they're still used today.
Yeah, in some cases still used. And so, so it's easy to imagine it. But anything made of wood, it's extraordinarily rare to have a piece of wood. I mean, sometimes it does because of a fire or whatever, to have a piece of wood that survives 2,000 years. And so wooden furniture and stuff like that, we just don't find that. But stuff carved from stone or pictures mosaics and things like that. And so sometimes we do get an idea of what the furniture might look like, but it doesn't survive from antiquity if it's made from wood.
And no doubt Jesus not only worked with wood, but stone as well.
Yeah, and that's why I don't think calling Jesus a carpenter or a son of a carpenter is the best translation. Tekton is the word that's used in the Greek Gospels, and it's cognate to architect. So architect means the chief builder. Tech or tekton means builder. And so that's probably the best way to translate it. So, Joseph was a builder. And of course, that meant using wood, but it also meant using stone and mortar and so on as well.
Okay. At Christmas, we often say the Magi saw the star in the east. We'll quote Matthew 2:2 and say the Magi saw the star in the eastern sky. Does that mean the star was do you think the star was in the west, or does it mean the Magi were in the east when they saw the star in the western sky?
I think you got it right. Your last option, I think they're in the east and they see the star, and the star is in the west. And by the way, I've done some work on the star background, and it relates to the Old Testament passage in the book of Numbers 24:17, the vision of Balaam. He sees the star that arises from Jacob, and that star is linked to prophecies and legends. It's a fascinating topic. It isn't just from the Hebrew books and the Hebrew prophets, but in the ancient Near East, there's this belief that was widespread, and we can trace it back at least to 1000 BC. Widespread belief that there would be some star in the west. And from a Roman perspective, the star was, of course, to the east. In other words, a star somewhere over Palestine or over Israel. And fascinating. There's even archaeological evidence for it. There's this inscription that was found in a collapsed house that dates to about 800 BC. And it's the same thing. It's talking about Balaam seeing something and being afraid and seeing doom coming. It's really an interesting thing. Wow. And so it frightened even Roman emperors, this talk of stars and so on. So it's a rich background. And so it's mentioned, of course, you're referring to the Gospel of Matthew. And so it'd be easy to imagine rumors about a star. Josephus talks about a star too that presaged the destruction of the temple in the year 70. And so it's easy to imagine rumors of a star, and apparently there was a comet of some sort near the end of Herod the Great's life, and how Herod the Great, who was so insecure even to the point of killing 3 of his sons in the last 2 or 3 years of his life, because he was afraid they were plotting against him and his throne.
He was paranoid. Very
paranoid, and probably was from a medical point of view. There was something wrong with him. He was sick. He was in decline. Could be dementia, delusional, and just plain crazy. And so what Matthew's talking about is, he hears these magi, these guys, these astrologers, these interpreters of the stars who have come from the east because they've seen a star. And they're looking for him, according to legend, according to popular belief that's been around for hundreds of years, that a king has been born. And he's thinking, oh, great, that's the last thing I need. And so he reacts violently, very much in keeping with his character. And I mean, he was a sick son of a gun at the end of his life. In fact, Emperor Augustus, who had been his friend, they'd supported each other for years. It is reported in a later source that Emperor Augustus on one occasion said, "I would rather be Herod's pig than his son." I mean, man, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement. And of course, he's making a joke out of the Jewish context because a pig is not going to be killed and eaten, in the Jewish world because it's not kosher. So I'd rather be Herod's pig instead of his son because I'd live longer. I mean, that's what's going on. So that's hardcore evidence that Herod was getting kooky, he was paranoid, and what Matthew tells us is something that is very plausible and something that could well have taken place.
Do you think the shepherds, while they were watching their flocks at night, saw this star?
Well, I suspect everybody did. It was, everybody saw the star. It was unavoidable. It was just how to interpret it. And again, if I go back to Josephus, I know that's a couple generations later. We go from a few years BC to the 60s AD. But he talks about a star and how it was widely interpreted different ways. And so you could see a star and you could interpret it your way and feel okay and good about it, or you could interpret it another way and be in a panic. And that's, you see that in the Romans too. I've read the Roman literature, and somebody sees a star or there's a strange lightning or something is happening. And some people say, well, this means the Caesar's got years to live, or it means no, he's going to die soon. And I think that same ambiguity and uncertainty is what plagued Herod the Great and drove him to extremes.
So we sing the song at Christmas time, "We Three Kings," and there's that phrase, "Westward leading." That's right, westward.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
were they kings? And do we know how many?
Yeah, no, yeah, they weren't kings. There's no reason to think they were kings. That's a legend that develops later, and of course, three is nothing more. I mean, there's nothing. There could have been two of them. There could have been five of them, but it's because three specific gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Three specific gifts are mentioned, and so it's assumed that each gift is assigned to one guy. And
Or
so you got
woman?
three magi, three gifts, and that's just it could be right, it could be correct, but it's just a guess. We don't know.
And maybe they were women.
And that's not likely. I guess theoretically it's possible, but it's unlikely.
So every December we have this romantic picture of the Magi arriving the night of Jesus' birth. For me, it seems that they showed up a couple of years later. Did the
Yeah.
Magi see Jesus the night of Jesus' birth?
No, I don't think so. If the star, was there, and then shortly thereafter Jesus was born, there was no way these guys could show up in time. And so I know in popular manger scenes, you see the manger and the Holy Family's there, and you've got the shepherds and the sheep, and then you got the camels and the magi, and they're all there at the same time. And that creates the impression that the shepherds of Luke's story and the magi of Matthew's story all occur on the same day or the same night. And that's not correct. And of course, any serious commentary will point that out. So the shepherds are portrayed as arriving the day of the birth or the night of the birth, whereas the magi show up clearly at a later time, which is why Herod wants to kill infants that are 2 years old or younger. If the magi had showed up at the same time the shepherds were there, then Herod would be after people that have been born in the last couple of days, not the last couple of years.
So we often collapse Matthew and Luke and put it all together.
Well, it sure makes it easier for a Christmas pageant celebrated at church. We're not going to say, okay, we're going to do the Luke part this year, and 2 years from now we'll do the Matthew part. Do it all together at once. That just makes it easier.
Somebody said, when you're setting up your nativity scene at home, do what we do. Put the Magi on the other side of the room. They're en route.
Yeah, that's right.
If you're looking for a new tradition, because it might take them a while to get there. Do you think that was a 2-year journey, a couple of weeks?
Well, it would be more than a couple of weeks. It wouldn't have to be 2 years. But we just don't know. See, we're utterly in the dark on the timing of the star when they see it, when they study it, when they decide, when they prepare to make a journey. How far away? We don't know how far in the east they were. Were they as far away as Babylon? You know, that's a long ways away, and but it still wouldn't take 2 years.
Does that word magi give some indication where,
No,
perhaps?
not really. No,
No.
no. Yeah, magus, magus in Latin, magos in Greek, magos in the plural, magoi, or in Latin, magi. That is so wide open. It can be very pejorative. It can mean like a magician, a conjurer.
Okay.
It could be a charlatan, a trickster, but it could also mean a wise man, a person who studies all kinds of things, including the stars, to gain insight as to what's going on in the world, that kind of thing. So it's a very wide ranging word, and so it could be used very imprecisely. There are these guys that are fact seekers, intelligent guys questing, and we're going to call them magi, although we actually don't know if that's what they were. See what I mean? So yeah, I think you have to be pretty open-minded on that question.
Okay. I remember you saying at Acadia University it would be unthinkable to the Jewish mind to construct the birth story from mythology. Yet some people today claim that the first Jewish Christians blended pagan myths to create the birth narrative.
Yeah.
What evidence is there that pagan myths have not been adopted into Jesus' birth narrative?
Well, the evidence, I think, is simply overwhelming. Um, the Christian writers know these pagan myths. They know about Hercules. They know about Dionysus. They know about Zeus and Hera and the whole gang, the Olympian gang. They are aware of that. And in some of the popular Christian stories, like the infancy gospels, and they're not in the Bible, they're not authoritative, you do see an attempt to compare Jesus in a positive way, in a very superior way, to some of these pagan ideas. But the idea of actually adopting a pagan story, especially by he's Jewish. He's trying to convince a skeptical synagogue that Jesus really is the Messiah and fulfiller of Jewish prophecies, that he keeps the law of Moses. In fact, he demands a higher level of keeping it than what you get with the scribes and the Pharisees. How would Matthew then adopt a pagan story, the Zeus who has sex with a woman, and that's how we get Hercules or Dionysus or Hermes or whatever? I just can't believe Matthew would countenance that. Matthew probably was scratching his head saying, maybe I should leave this out, because there will be some people who read it and go, oh man, that's just another Zeus story, where he's involved with some attractive human woman. And so I could see how Matthew would want to leave it out. But for Matthew, it's just too important. And there are special conceptions in the Old Testament. So Sarah's real old, but God enables her to conceive. Hannah can't seem to conceive. God enables her to. And so there's this recognition that God does special things, and sometimes it does create a cloud of suspicion. There are some tainted women, you might say, in the Old Testament. And that, it's just there. And that's why Matthew puts these women in his genealogy. He actually mentions the wife of Uriah the Hittite, whom David murdered. And of course, he doesn't mention her by name, but it's Bathsheba. And so he's aware, Matthew knows that there's some dodgy stuff in the Messianic line, and he doesn't want to hide it. So he brings it out. But I just can't believe that Matthew would say, oh, let's just make up a story that sounds like paganism. Are you kidding? Matthew would do the opposite. He would say, no, we're not going to include this because, And so it was very important. It was well known. And yes, there was gossip, there were rumors, and there's hints of this in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John. But it's so important and it connects so well to the Old Testament, Matthew just can't leave it out.
And Mike Lacona, he talks about this, and I like what he said. He said, we remember the Titanic that hit the iceberg. Half the passengers died in 1912. And 14 years before the sinking of the Titanic, there was a book called The Wreck of the Titan. And nobody would say that the Titanic was a fictional story taken from that book.
Yeah, that's true. I actually have that book, The Wreck of the Titan. And it is a phenomenal coincidence. And the size of the fictional Titan in the novel that came out in 1898, the size of the ship and other aspects of dimensions and specs are almost identical to the real Titanic that did sink in 1912. Wow. It really is amazing.
It is. Next question. Is it true that Jesus was born in the year 0?
Well, this is a good question. First of all, there is no year 0. That came up when we were at the year 1999 and we were getting ready to flip the calendar page and go to the year 2000. Everybody thought the year 2000 was the beginning of a new millennium, and they just didn't realize that, no, it's the year 2000. That's the last year of the millennium. 2001 is the beginning of the new millennium and the new century. And people were confused. And I actually saw people say, well, no, we go from the year 0 and to the year 9, that's the first decade, or the year 0 to the year 99, that's the first century. No. There is no year 0. We go from 1 BC to 1 AD, okay? And so to answer your question, no, there's no year 0. But actually, it's really interesting. This whole question of when Herod the Great died, and this is what it hinges on. When did Herod die? And it was proposed about 130 years ago that Herod died in 4 BC. And that became the standard traditional view ever since. That is being seriously reassessed now. We're thinking that he probably died in 1 BC. And of course, this BC thing was because of the calendar getting sorted out hundreds of years later, and there was a miscalculation, and that's why, Jesus was supposed to be born in the year 1 AD. That was the whole idea of the calendar. And then a few years were left out, and so it got pushed back. Well, Jesus's birth was always attached to when we think Herod died. So Jesus was born a year or so before Herod died. Well, we now think Herod died in 1 BC, and Jesus was probably born in 2 BC, not 5 or 6 BC, as some have said. Now, Jarvis, what's interesting is we think Jesus' ministry began in the year 28 AD and ended in the year 30. Now, there are those who argue for 33, and so that's a different time. So Jesus was crucified either in 30 or 33. Well, I tend to lean toward 30. If Jesus' ministry began in 28 AD, he's 30 years old, about. And that's actually what Luke says. When Jesus was about 30, his public ministry got underway. And that, I think, supports the 2 BC birth date for Jesus and the 1 BC death date for Herod the Great.
Okay. Speaking of dates, December 25th, is that the day?
No, it's probably not. Some people go, with the shepherds, and they're out in the fields. And so they say Jesus probably was born in April or something like that, March, April, something like that. That's above my pay grade. I'm not a calendar guy. I'm not a weatherman. I'm not real sure on that, but that's part of the argument. But the selecting the date December 25th is arbitrary. And so showing the manger with the camels and the sheep, and they're covered in snow, as if they're in Europe in December. I mean, that obviously is myth. But December 25th was an important holiday in the Roman Empire. And so zeroing in on that date, I mean, it was smart politics. Even Easter has associations, um, and so you get these dates that everybody recognizes. And then the emperor says, why don't we make that the date when we celebrate this? Because you all take the day off anyway. And so there's a little bit of that going on. So it's a little bit of politics, but it's also a matter of convenience. And by the way, that's what people do today. There are
Yes.
people, they're not Christians. There are people who don't even believe in God, and they're glad to have an Easter holiday, and they're glad to have Christmas off, and they celebrate it anyway. So they're just doing the very same thing, only in reverse.
Okay. In your book, Jesus and the Manuscripts, you mention about Jesus and the Quran, and you touched base on this a little bit already. I've heard people say that Jesus is the same in Christianity and Islam. Is Jesus's birth and life different in the Quran than what's found in the Gospels?
Yeah, very definitely. As I said earlier, Muhammad is happy to recognize Jesus as very special, born by the Spirit of God, so Mary is a virgin. He defends Mary's honor. He defends Jesus against Jewish insults and criticisms, like Jesus was born out of wedlock, or Jesus was a sorcerer involved in black magic, or something like that. Muhammad is offended by that, but of course Muhammad disagrees with Christians. Muhammad tells Christians that there's nothing divine about Jesus. He's only a prophet. And in fact, one of Jesus's greatest prophecies is that he foretells the coming of Muhammad, who would even be a greater prophet. And of course, this is stuff that's 600 years, a good 600 years after the time of Jesus, 500 years after the time that the Gospels were written. And so I don't know where Muhammad gets all of this. I've read the Quran. I've published actually some articles relating to it. I want to continue studying it. The use of biblical materials in the Quran. Muhammad, I don't think, ever read anything in the Bibles. In fact, some Muslims say he couldn't read at all, but he was very good memory and he'd recite things. And the word Quran means recitation. And so his acquaintance with the Bible is very unsure, very uncertain. It's secondhand, third hand. Apparently he had a cousin, we think, who was a Christian, and so he knew some Christians, seemed to be acquainted a little bit with the Gospels of Luke and John, which were popular in that part of the world, east of the Byzantine Empire. But yeah, the Jesus of the Quran is very, very different. The biblical material presented in the Quran tends to be distorted and confused.
And more Muslims are moving to the West, and so it's so important to understand who the real Jesus is.
Yeah, I agree with that. And of course, Christians, it used to be a Christian world in the West, and even people that didn't believe in God necessarily or weren't really observant Christians, they at least knew biblical content fairly well, but that isn't true anymore. And so the West is biblically illiterate, and Christians don't know the Bible as well as they should, and that's part of the problem. And so a Muslim comes along and says, well, no, this is what Jesus is all about, and the average Christian isn't even sure how to respond to that. And so Christians need to up their game and understand what's in the Bible much, much better, read the Gospels. And I don't think there's some books out there about Jesus in the Quran or the Bible in the Quran. I'm not going to name any books right now, but there are a few out there that have been recently published. And in fact, I've got a book with Jeremiah Johnston called Jesus and the Jihadis. And so, you can learn about this and get a little better acquainted. And I really think Christians need to up their game for the very reason you just said, because there are more and more Muslims moving into the West, and they don't know what's in the Quran. They don't really know the Jesus story very well. And so Christians need to know their stuff better so they can explain these things to Muslims that they encounter.
Yes. One final question. Our culture overall dismisses the Christmas story. They treat it like Red Riding Hood. Why should the world believe in the Christmas story?
The world desperately needs the Christmas story, because what the Christmas story is all about is God actually cares about humanity, and it's a redemptive project. God has entered the world in a very, very special way in bringing his son into the world to save the world. And so to ignore the true meaning of Christmas is to ignore the vaccine. It's to ignore the antidote that humanity desperately needs. So this Christmas story should be taken seriously, and trying to poke holes at it and say, oh, that didn't happen or this couldn't happen. I think that's unfortunate, and it then misses the whole point of it. It's too important to just blow off and ignore.
Well, Dr. Evans, we all know Michelangelo's masterpiece in the Sistine Chapel. At one time, a coating was placed over the painting to protect it, and the coating aged, changing the color, changing the artwork. And eventually, this coating was cleaned off, and we could see robust colors of this painting. And there's a coating over the Christmas story. And when we take off that coating, we still see, thankfully, a beautiful story. A story of grace, a story of our Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And thank you so much for painting a real picture of the real Jesus.
Well, you're very welcome, because, let's not let Santa Claus hijack Christmas. That's not really the Christmas story. It's about God giving us his son. And by the way, you recognize this cup? Hey, that's Acadia.
I still have mine.
Yeah, there you go. So see, I'm a Acadia alumnus. So there you go.
It's official. Well, thank you so much, and Merry Christmas to you. And hopefully we'll see you down the road sometime.
You're very welcome, Jarvis. I enjoyed the interview very much. Good to see you.
All right, you too.